So, hi. I better put these down. Thank you for coming. Um, I wanted to start tonight by just thanking Marshall and Politics and Prose because the first time I ever saw a C-SPAN event on Politics and Prose, it was when a friend of mine was here, Amos Elon. And I remember just watching this and thinking it was such a wonderful thing to do. And when I started to do the research on this book and thought about what I wanted to do and how unusual it was, I went to him and I asked him what he thought. And he's generous, but he was particularly generous that day. And he said, you know, this will work. You should do it. And I spent the next 2.5 years working on this book. So I like being here for that reason. I wanted to start by, I'm going to read a little bit, but I wanted to start by telling you just why I wrote this book and why I wrote it the way I did. This book is about the people who were on the ground at Guantanamo Bay when the first 100, 200, 300 detainees arrived, and their attempts to handle a situation in which they'd been given no directives, no laws, no policies, and basically been told, you're on an island, do what you can. You know basically how to treat people. You may not have detained people before, but it's not rocket science. You don't have to follow the Geneva Conventions. Work it out. We'll get back to you with a policy. And so this book is about how those people reacted to that circumstance and how they got to know the first batch of detainees outside of the idea these are the worst of the worst. And the book is somewhat atmospheric. It's an attempt to set a mood because what happened at Guantanamo Bay was largely about a struggle for the mood of the place. That might sound a little simplistic, but it's not, or a little soft, but it's not. Because one thing for sure about enhanced interrogation and serious interrogations, the way we've come to know them, is that they rely on a climate of instability. If you're in the military and you see it as your mission to create a stable, functioning, working, organized routine, and that attempt is dismantled, and there's a purpose to it being dismantled, that what they wanted was a chaotic and unstable environment, then you have a battle. And this book is about the battle that ensued subtly as well as directly between the uniformed military that was on the ground at Guantanamo Bay and the people in the Pentagon and the White House and throughout the executive that were intent on making it into not a detention center, not a pretrial center, not a prisoner of war environment, but an interrogation center. And so I'm going to read part of it so that you just get a sense of what the book is like, and then I'll interrupt myself when I think I should, and then I'll take your questions. If I hadn't written about the first 100 days, I would have written about the first day of Guantanamo Bay, the day that the detainees arrived. And actually, I considered doing that book because it's unbelievably interesting. There were a million decisions made both prior to that day and during that day, and each one of them is sort of a discrete moment that tells you how our policy could have been handled in a right and correct way and a legal way, and how it was usurped by other forces. So this passage is from that day. At this point in time, the guards, the troops, there are 2,000 military that have been brought down, as Marshall said, put in tent cities that they built for themselves. And they're on the ground. They've rehearsed a million times what to do, a million times in the week that they had to build Guantanamo Bay and to prepare for these detainees. And so I thought I would read you. The plane from Kandahar was expected to land circa 1500 hours. Having dispatched one of his men to Afghanistan in anticipation of the arrivals, the general in charge, Michael Leonard, knew just when the plane had departed. The first flight was a direct one, as there was still some worry about landing on foreign soil and thus violating laws of transporting prisoners. Braced for anything, the naval-based community itself stood breathless. Touchdown came nearly an hour ahead of the estimated time of arrival. And so one thing you need to know is that when Guantanamo Bay opened, it wasn't just an island with nobody on it. There was a community there, a community of people with, schools and mothers and children who accepted these people into their midst, who knew that the worst of the worst were coming, and who took a community vote and decided that they didn't want to stay, that they didn't want to leave. that they wanted to stay at Guantanamo Bay, which is something interesting to think about when you look at how the communities around Leavenworth and elsewhere in this country have reacted when they say, are they going to bring the detainees to this country for trial? And they're like scared that they'll be a terrorist target. So anyway. As expected, when the plane landed and the rear hatchway of the C-141 opened, the first to appear in the opening was the head of the Ravens, who reported in with the waiting security force. The manifest was turned over, and custody was formally transferred to the Marines, who would keep custody until they reached X-ray. Before the detainees emerged from the plane, troops aboard the plane lugged out a room-sized metal container. Press observers gasped, thinking in the fearful atmosphere of the day that perhaps the container was a type of cell, that perhaps the likes of Hannibal Lecter were on board, unable to be unrestrained and unboxed even for a moment. As it turned out, it was only an in-flight latrine. When the detainees finally did appear, they looked like anything but the worst of the worst that President Bush's press secretary, Ari Fleischer, had proclaimed them to be. Disheveled and frail, wobbly from their long trips, stinking of urine and wearing blackened goggles, earmuffs, orange socks, and knitted caps, they looked like aliens, perhaps, but not like purveyors of danger and destruction. The spectacle shocked the guards on the ground. We didn't know they would be like that, hooded and goggled. They didn't tell us they were coming in, sensory deprivation, nor did they know that some of the detainees would be so weak that they had to be carried off the plane between two guards, 105-pound guys, as one onlooker put it, and the Marines just lifting them like that, like a bag of groceries. And actually, in this first several batches of detainees, this was the story they would find more and more. Two of them were over 80 years old. One of them was a nonagenarian. One of them was a diagnosed schizophrenic. And so the idea that they were the worst of the worst began to crumble very quickly in the ideas of the military. And remember, the military believed these were the worst of the worst. Over time, they came to distinguish that there were, some people were there who were dangerous, and some people were there who were more likely people who had been at the wrong place at the wrong time. But their doubts, the fact that they didn't have a policy, began to spread very early. The Marines lifted the detainees' earmuffs as they entered the bus. "You are now the property of the U.S. Marine Corps," the Marines shouted in English. Once all 20 had been let off the plane and loaded onto the bus, the transfer order to the JTF custody was signed. JTF is the Joint Task Force 160 that accepted the detainees, and Michael Leonard was officially in charge. The bus wound its way toward the ferry dock 300 meters away. It climbed from the boat up past the road where Debbie Bune and her son Will, just home from school, waited. As soon as they had seen the ferry pull onto the beachhead by the salinization plant, they had jumped in the car to witness the passengers who would be riding by their road. Climbing toward Debbie Bune's vantage point in the direction of the McDonald's, the post office, and the elementary school, the bus made it to the top of the hill where Debbie and her son waited. She pulled Will closer to her side as the bus approached. When she glimpsed the silhouette of a soldier standing on the bus, the nose of his rifle pointed down at the detainees, she felt secure and somehow vindicated. As First Lady of the Naval Base, she contained her emotions under the professional demeanor of a member of the U.S. military. All that armor, the vehicles, the guns, the combat gear in full display, and then the yellow school bus designed to transport innocent American children, now being used to convey the opposite of American innocence, namely terrorists. Her observation of the incongruity apparent in the use of a school bus for the alleged terrorists was not unlike General Leonard's own sense that the use of the military to handle a penal mission was disturbingly out of place. Within days, the buses would be painted a grayish white, but the process of getting ready, the call to action, had been too rapid. There had been as little time for paint as for newly crafted policy. As a writer, Debbie knew that the image of the school bus was the one by which she would remember the day, the capsule shot that best explained the situation they were all now in, the unraveling of American icons in the wake of 9/11, and the usurping of institutions dedicated to American honor and decency. What happened at Guantanamo Bay in these first days was that the professionalism that the military lives by was pushed aside. And most of the story about what happened at Guantanamo, at Abu Ghraib, at Bagram, and elsewhere in terms of interrogation and torture has been told to convince readers and the public that this was the work of higher-ups in the Pentagon, higher-ups in the executive and elsewhere. But the best way to tell this story, I think, is to look not at it's wonderful to look at the top, and I think these books have been fabulous, and I can read them and reread them. But one other way to tell the story of was this the policy of something at the top is to look at who was there at the, and I hate to use this word, but at the bottom, on the ground, who was receiving the orders, because that's where you really get a sense of what happened. So what did happen when these men and women received the 300 detainees?